Welcome. This is using the Enpublica data connector for Power BI tutorial 3. Now, in the first few tutorials, we've looked at how to connect to the FRED database. We've primarily been focusing on how to pull back series, either series metadata or the actual series observations. In this particular tutorial, we're going to look at some of the other calls that we've implemented. The best way to get started is to download the report for this tutorial, and I'll put the link to the repo here at the bottom of the video. But go ahead and download that tutorial. And again, if you haven't followed with us along before, you do need a API key from the FRED database, so make sure you get that in order to be able to refresh the report itself. After you've done that, though, we'll go ahead and flip over the report. We got quite a bit to cover, so I'm going to hit this pretty quickly, but hopefully you can, between this video, the written documentation, and the example itself, you'll be able to get anything you need out of it. So let's go ahead and open up the report here, and you can see a couple of different report pages are implemented. First thing I'm going to do, though, is we're going to go to Transform Data and bring up the Power Query Editor. And in the Power Query Editor, you'll notice we've already implemented several different what we call groups, or just ways to categorize things. We've got several different functions that we've already imported. We've actually called several of the functions, so I've tried to use a naming standard of FN for functions and QRY for queries. And by the way that we got all these function definitions is you could go to New Source, More, and then in Get Data, you can just search for the Enpublica data connector. ENP should do it. And then when you click Connect, all I've done here to grab all these function definitions is we chose Enpublica FRED as the data source, and then in the Navigator window, we just went ahead and we expanded everything, right? And we just started checking off all of the functions, and then we loaded them up. So that's all we've done here is we've loaded up every available function. So now we can kind of take a look at several of them. Let's start with the functions at the top here under category. So function FRED category, not too much to this one. You can just enter in a category ID and hit invoke. All that does is you can see the result here. It just returns a little bit of information about a particular category. Similarly, FRED category children, enter in an ID, and you can see the results here. It just returns all of the children categories first level down for a particular category ID. And then the other one here, FRED category series, just for a particular category and some optional filters here, returns all of the series for that given category and any filters that you apply. So this result set's going to look just like a function FRED series, except these are series for a given category instead of filters that you've applied. Okay. Moving on. So the next one here, this one is not a FRED function. It's something that we've implemented here. Think of it as a utility function. It can take as an input a table and then an optional column ID. And you can see an example of this being called here. So in this case, I called the output from this function up here, FRED category series, right? Remember, this was just returning a bunch of series for a given category ID. And then that was our input, and we just said, hey, give me back the ID. So effectively, all it did is it took this table, took the table from this particular, oops, wrong one, sorry. It took this table, right, and it said, hey, for this table and this particular column, for all of these IDs, I'm going to convert that into a string, a comma delimited string. Now, why is that important? Well, this can now be the input to another function. So for example, you recall FRED series observations, right? This is a function that we can use. We pass in one or more series IDs, comma separated. Well, that's what we've done here in this query FRED series observations. We passed in the output, i.e. the result of that string function, or the query that called that string function. And that way we've basically been able to take this this list, which again comes from category series, and we're feeding that into the Fred series observation. So now we can pull back all of the applicable observations for a set of series. Anyway, so just a nice utility function. Another kind of miscellaneous function is this one called Fred other. So there are a lot of function calls that Fred implements. We don't implement all of them just because some of them just don't seem as to make as much sense within the Power BI desktop. But if you need to call one, well, you already got your API key stored here. So we've implemented this thing called Fred other. You can put in the path and any parameters you need to put in. Here's an example, this query other category tags, where I've called that function we passed. So that's the function is category tags. And then in this case, this is the parameter that we're passing in, which is a given category. Quick note, after you've pulled back a result set using Fred other, it's gonna give you raw JSON. So you'll need to do a little bit of Power Query goodness to get your final transformation into a good format. So in this case, tags were returned in this column called tags as a list. So I removed other columns and just expanded that list into a set of records and then selected the columns I need. Okay. So moving on, we've got releases. Releases is a table. It just shows the 300 some odd releases along with a link to that particular source release so you can see where Fred is pulling from. Release series, much like category series, just gives back the set of series for a given release and optional parameters. Release table, now this one's actually kind of handy. You enter in a release ID along with an element ID. And to understand what that looks like, if you go to the Fred website and you browse by release, I'm going to go ahead to page 3, looking for gross domestic product. And there's a couple of sections here listed. We'll go to section 1. And these are the release tables. So for example, let's pick table 116, real gross domestic product. And we'll pick a quarterly view. And notice up here in the browser, we've got a release ID of 53 and an EID, element ID of 13026. That's what we need to remember. But what this is, it's a hierarchical view of gross domestic product, kind of like a chart of accounts, the major accounts that make up GDP for a given quarter. So we can use that release ID and element ID within this query to pull back this table, right? And I renamed one of the columns, but the basic idea is if we go look at the releases page here in the report, let's biggie size release table for a minute. And I did a little bit of cleanup on the name. I just indented it according to the level. There's a calculated column you can look at. But again, for a quick view of a quasi hierarchical view of data, this is pretty nice. And of course, you could take all of the series IDs and feed that into the series or series observations function to get back all of the detailed information for a given release table if you want to. Okay, so moving on to series. I'm not going to spend too much time here. We've looked at Fred series and Fred series observations quite a bit in prior tutorials. Those are the workhorse of pulling back a lot of what you're going to need in Power BI from Fred. Last one would be sources. Sources, again, just a table shows you the different sources that Fred pulls from, can be kind of handy as a reference guide. And with that, hey, we're done. Again, I invite you to look at this report, and you can kind of peruse the different pages to see some of these things, some of these calls just cleaned up a little bit and being used within a visual for the most part tables. But thanks so much for joining it. In a future release, we're gonna switch over to the next major data source that the Enpublica Data Connector supports. That's the Energy Information Administration, or EIA database. So stay tuned, and thanks again for joining.